And that's basically how mature Christians, at least, have resolved this, is that we don't have to agree in every one of these areas, okay? It's not like we're talking about the gospel here. What is the gospel? Or how do we get together with God? Those central issues, we all agree on those anyway. But these are more peripheral issues where there's room for disagreement, and the best thing to do is to consider it that's a matter of conscience. So my conscience lets me go here, your conscience doesn't. Let's just let it be that way and not judge each other. We cannot impose matters of conscience on other people. If my conscience is bothered by doing something, that doesn't mean that I can say you shouldn't be doing it either. I should follow my own conscience and not judge. Now, that's the basic point being made here in Romans 14. But I want to complicate this so that you'll have a full-orbed, deeper theology. So we are going to go to the parallel passage where he gets into a very similar discussion, similar in some ways, but completely different in other ways. And it makes an interesting contrast. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 8. We already read these verses where he says there's no such thing as an idol in the first place. And then he comes down and he says in verse 7, however, not all of us have this knowledge. But some, being accustomed to the idol until now, eat food as if it were sacrificed to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. Okay, so here is another case he brings up in this passage, the weaker brother. Just like he did in Romans 14, the weak man is weak in faith. And in both passages, there's the weaker brother. But notice, the weaker brother in this passage is different than the ones in Romans, aren't they? These, being accustomed to the idol until now, these are idol worshippers who have recently found faith in Christ. Whereas in Romans, it was the hardliners, the Jews, who were weak in faith. Mark that well. He says, food will not commend us to God. We're neither the worse if we do not eat or the better if we do eat. There's the theology again. There's the facts, okay? This doesn't even matter, this whole business with food. But, he says, take care that this liberty of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. He says, if someone sees you, who have all this knowledge, dining in an idol temple, will not his conscience, if he is weak, be strengthened to eat things sacrificed to idols? For through your knowledge, he who is weak is ruined, the brother for whose sake Christ died. And so here's what he's envisioning. It's like this recently converted idol worshippers bopping down the street. He's realized, it's all about Christ and God, the Creator. And then he's walking by and he's looking and he's over there and he's like, wow, that's Dennis eating in the temple of Aphrodite over there. Demeter. And so he goes on walking down and he's like, maybe I'm being a little too hard line. I mean, if he's doing it, it must be all right. And he's not even just thinking, well, Demeter's not real or anything like that. He's still thinking, like most of them did, these are that if it's okay to eat there, maybe mixing a little idol worship in wouldn't be such a bad thing after all. After all, was the norm in the ancient world. You didn't pick between this and that. You'd just be like, I believe both of them. And you would add more and more gods to the collection of gods that you believe. And so this weak brother here might conclude, maybe I'm being too legalistic by thinking that Christ has to be the only one that I'm loyal to. I could maybe get back into some of those fun worship services they have for Aphrodite. Or you get to take a roll in the hay with some temple prostitute or whatever. And he ends up doing something which earlier he believed was violated his conscience and could be ruined. A lot could be at stake. He could lose his Christian walk if he starts being syncretistic and mixing idol worship in with the worship of the true God. So the stakes are pretty high here. So let's compare these two scenarios, okay? The similarities between the Corinth situation and the Rome situation are pretty striking. They both talk about eating things sacrificed to idols, right? They both refer to stumbling your brother. Just be sure you don't stumble your brother. And both are concerned about weaker brothers and taking care of them. On the other hand, the differences are there as well. In 1 Corinthians 8, the weaker brother is accustomed to the idol until now, so he's a converted idol worshiper. In Romans 14, the guy who's weak in faith, eats only vegetables and so on, is the converted Jews who abhor idolatry and want nothing to do with it. So they couldn't be more different. If we put it on a scale here, the Corinthian brother thinks that Christian liberty means we can do whatever we want, including even worshiping other gods. So he's way too permissive, dangerously permissive. These Roman guys, though, they think that evil is so contagious, so dangerous, that even coming in contact with it, even if there's no intent there, could defile you and could mess you up. And so they're super restrictive. They're too restrictive. And so, isn't that interesting? Utterly polar opposite people, and yet the solution to both turns out to be the same. How could that be? It's because in both cases the principles of servant love suggest to the main group of believers giving up some of my freedoms, some of the liberties that I could have, that I'm entitled to, for the sake of not messing up this weaker brother. And at the same time, not judging them and holding them in contempt for their ignorance. In other words, the governing principle is not, look, what am I allowed to do? The governing principle is what would be loving to my brothers and sisters. The very point that he's been making for the last couple of chapters. And so we're not hyper-restrictive, and we're not permissive where anything goes. We stand in a position where we have the liberty, but we're not necessarily going to use it because we care about other people more than getting my yucks and my freedom out there. So we end up, we're free to eat meat, and yet we're restrained by love from just carelessly using that freedom.